ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.
Hello and welcome listeners, it's time for Genealogy Radio Show from Radio Cork-Bushkin, the radio station that is keeping you in the loop. And this week's show is all about the DNA and its benefits in your genealogical research. So first of all, let's start by introducing our guest on the phone today, Dr. Maurice Gleeson. So Maurice, you're very welcome to Genealogy Radio Show.
Thanks, Colin. It's great to be here.
Good stuff. So Maurice, could you start by telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, I'm a doctor by profession. I started off as a psychiatrist, and I did that for 5 years, and then I moved into the pharmaceutical industry, and I was there for about 10 years or so, and then I became a professional actor and ended up on the West End stage for one night only. And then I became a genealogist and got into genealogy in a big way about 10 years ago, and 2 years after getting into that, I discovered DNA, and I've been interested in DNA and genetic genealogy ever since.
So why exactly did you get involved in genealogy? Do you have interest there or how?
Well, it was actually because my mum had passed away about 10 years ago, 2005, and I needed a project that I could do with my dad, who was left alone in the family home, where I could just get in touch with him a bit more frequently, because I'm over in London, he's in Dublin. So I thought, actually, why don't I join him on the family tree? Because he's been doing it on and off for the last 30 years or so. And I always remember as a teenager, we'd go over to Granny's house on a Sunday afternoon, and he'd bring out the engineering graph paper, and he'd be scribbling away in the graph paper while Granny was telling him about all the different ancestors in the family tree. So I thought this would be a good project to take up with him again. And that's how I got involved in it, because I very quickly became addicted to the whole thing, because it's just such great fun. And it put him in touch with cousins he hadn't seen in 60 years. We've met second cousins from Los Angeles we'd never met before. And it just opened up new social outlets for him and for me that we never had thought possible. So it was a great way of working on a project with my dad, and also finding out fascinating things about the stories of our ancestors and the times that they lived through. So that's how I got involved with it.
Very good. So and what about genetic genealogy? How did you get involved in that?
Well, like I say, about 2 years into starting on the family tree research, I came across the National Genographic Test. They had a DNA test out, and I thought, oh, that looks really good. I must buy those DNA kits and see where I come from. So I bought one kit for the father's line, and another kit for the mother's line, and I was going to do the tests, and then I suddenly thought, actually, these would make great Christmas presents for my dad. So why don't I give them to my father for Christmas? Because whatever DNA I got from him, he'll have passed it down to me, and whatever results he gets on the DNA tests, they'll also apply to me. And then I suddenly thought, actually, how do I know he's my father? Because how would you know? How would you know if you were a secret adoption? You wouldn't, because it's secret. So I was a little bit concerned, because I knew he was my dad. Of course he was my dad. But I'd actually no way of knowing. And that kind of illustrated a very good point with DNA testing, is that it can throw up some surprises. So it does come up with a little bit of a government health warning. As one of the CEOs of one of the commercial testing companies says, if you don't like skeletons, don't go opening closets. So that's a very, very important aspect of DNA testing, is that it might show up secret adoptions. It might show up half siblings that you never knew existed. So you do have to be a little bit circumspect about doing the test. But I went ahead, gave the test to my dad. The results came back. I hoped they were relevant to me, and a couple of years later when I did a different type of test, I found out that I did share 50% of my DNA with my father, which is exactly what you'd expect, and so all of my concerns were alleviated at that point in time.
Very good. That's very interesting. So what exactly is DNA, and how can it help you in your own family research?
Well, we all have DNA inside us. Every cell in our body has 46 chromosomes. 23 of them we get from our father, 23 of them we get from our mother, and there are 3 different types of DNA. First of all, there's the Y DNA, and that's only passed down from father to son. That's the Y chromosome, and it's passed from father to son. So I would have got my Y chromosome from my father. He would have got it from his father, 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 goes all the way back along the direct male line around about 200,000 years ago to when man was running around Africa as anatomically modern humans. So it's very, very good for migration studies. And that's the Y DNA, and it only goes back along the father line. It changes very little from generation to generation, so it's a very useful marker for doing surname studies and tracking your surname back along your father line, and also for migration studies, for tracking the path of human migration out of Africa about 50,000 years ago and how it populated the rest of the world thereafter, arriving in Ireland about 8,000 years ago or so, just about 8,000 years ago. So that's the Y DNA, father line. On the other side of the family tree, we have the mother line, and there's a type of DNA called mitochondrial DNA, and the mitochondrial DNA only gets passed on from mothers to their children. The boys don't pass it on to their children, it's only the girls pass it on. So I would have got my mitochondrial DNA from my mother. She would have got it from her mother. She would have got it from her mother, mother, all the way back, again, about 200,000 years ago, back to Africa. And it's a very, very useful type of DNA for researching the migration of the females out of Africa about 50,000 years ago or so. Not as much useful for genealogical purposes unless you have maybe, say, 2 women that you think might be sisters back in the 1800s, and you could use mitochondrial DNA to support the idea that they actually were descended from the same mother. So that's the second type of DNA, the mitochondrial DNA, mother line. Now, of course, between the father line on one side and the mother line on the other side, you have the majority of your ancestors. And the test that covers all of those ancestors in the middle is the autosomal test, and that's the chromosomes. So you could say chromosomal instead of autosomal. We say autosomes because it's all 23 of those chromosome pairs apart from the last pair. Pair number 23 are the sex chromosomes, the X chromosome and the Y chromosome, and those are the ones that determine your gender, your sex. So all the other chromosomes are called autosomes, and we call that test the autosomal DNA test, and that is very useful for connecting you with cousins with whom you share a common ancestor within the last 5, 6, 7 generations. So that's going back maybe 200, 250 years. It might take you back to about 1700, 1750, that type of time point. But beyond that, it's far too dilute to actually be of any use. So the autosomal test only has a reach of about 200 years. So it's very, very recent ancestry, whereas the other 2 tests, the Y DNA for the father, and the mitochondrial DNA for the mother, they can go back 200,000 years. So that's a major difference between these different types of DNA test. And those are the 3 types.
Very good. You already mentioned a test you did with your father. So besides that, what other successes have you had yourself in this area?
Well, we've had a few actually, because when I did my family tree, I suppose it's very similar to most Irish people. They get stuck at around about 1830, 1800. So in my family tree, on half of my lines, I've been able to go back to about 1800, and in the other half, I've been able to go back to about 1830. So I've identified half of all my great-great-great-grandparents, and but I'm stuck on the other half. So one of these great-great-great-grandparents was a chap called Patrick Spearin from Tipperary, and he was born sometime around about 1800, but we didn't have a baptism record for him. We just had a marriage record for him in Tipperary around about 1828 or so. And I was stuck on that particular one. So that was the surname that I started on when I started doing my genealogy, because Spearin was a rather unusual name, and it was spelt Spierin. And when I started looking into these, I met some collaborators online, people who'd also been researching the Spearin name for many more years than I had, and they were similarly stuck at around about 1800 in most instances. But one or two families had married into the Hartwell family, and the children had been named Hartwell Spearin, and they were able to go back, because of this unusual surname combination, they were able to go back to these old wills in Limerick in the early 1700s, which talked about the Hartwell family marrying into the Spearin family. So they felt confident that their family went back to these early Limerick Spearins. So what we did was, they did a DNA test, the Y DNA test, Spearin, 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 Spearin. I managed to get hold of my third cousin, who was also called Spearin, and he tested his direct male line, which of course was Spearin, 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 and lo and behold, my Spearin family matched the other Spearin families who were able to go back into the 1700s and into the late 1600s. And so because of that match, I was able to piggyback on the genealogical research that they had done, and I was able to jump back from Tipperary in 1800 to Limerick in the late 1600s. So it is a great way of actually focusing my own research, and it helped me jump back 3 generations further than I'd actually been able to achieve myself. So that was one example of how the Y DNA test in this particular instance was very, very useful for helping me to break through that brick wall and show me avenues of research that I would never have thought of researching otherwise.
That's brilliant. So, sorry to cut across you there, but what do you see the future of genetic genealogy being?
Well, I think that more and more people in Ireland are testing. I run the DNA lectures up at Back to Our Past in Dublin every October, and I also help my colleague Debbie Kennett put together the lecture program for the DNA lectures at Who Do You Think You Are in Birmingham every April. And we've been running the Back to Our Past lectures for the last 4 years, and they've proved very, very successful. The lectures are sponsored by Family Tree DNA, who are very, very supportive of the genetic genealogy community, and we are collecting more and more DNA from people in Ireland all the time and making more and more connections between Irish people and helping people break down their brick walls. So it's not only myself in Dublin, it's people like Paddy Waldron, who's with the Clare Roots Society over in Clare, people like Anne-Marie Coughlin, who runs the DNA Cork group, and they are distributing kits, DNA kits as well, and collecting DNA from these localized area. So I think in the future we'll find that as more Irish people do the DNA testing, there will be more people matching each other, more people breaking through brick walls in their own family tree research. And these anybody who's running a clan gathering or a family gathering should apply to Family Tree DNA for some kits, or they can get them through me. If they write to me, then they can do it, and I can organize it for them. For example, the Gleeson clan gathering that I'm organizing is down in Neenah in August, and we'll be having DNA testing down there. So if anybody wants to have DNA tested in Neenah in August, there are going to be kits available at the Gleeson clan gathering. So there are these type of events happening all over the country, And I think within the next 5 years or so, the whole face of Irish genealogy is going to change completely, largely as a result of more people taking up DNA testing.
Very good. So where do you actually see it being in 5 years' time?
In 5 years' time, I think there's going to be some very exciting developments. Now, you might be aware of a project that's been run by the Genealogical Society of Ireland in conjunction with the Royal College of Surgeons of Ireland called the Irish DNA Atlas Project. And what they're doing is absolutely fascinating. They're looking at DNA from people who have 8 great-grandparents from exactly the same area, within a 30-mile radius, that type of area. So it's very, very localized, geographically localized DNA testing. And because they're looking at 8 great-grandparents, they're getting a snapshot of DNA from that particular area from 1850. So that's 150 years ago. Yeah, 8 great-grandparents, 150 years ago, 1850, and it's a snapshot of the DNA of that particular time, which is just as the famine is coming to an end. And of course, this was a time when people didn't really move around, so what we will be able to define is the genetic signature of the different geographic areas around Ireland, and we'll be able to see if certain places in Ireland have a specific geographic signature. Now, Ed Gilbert, who is working on this project for the RCSI and GSI, he has presented the results at the DNA lectures at Back to Our Past last October, and he also presented the results in Birmingham in April, and they're fairly preliminary results, but the great news is that they have been able to identify distinct genetic groups within Ireland, at least 9 distinct genetic groups. And for a genealogist, that's really important because DNA testing in the future could mean that if you do a DNA test, the results will come back and it might say 10% of your DNA is from Southwest Ireland, 20% of it is from the west of Ireland, 30% of it is Ulster Scot, and 40% of it is from the Wexford Waterford area. And that will be really, really helpful, especially for diaspora Irish, to focus your research in looking at specific documentary records. So I think that's going to be one of the major exciting developments in the next 5 years. Another very interesting development will be our ability to use Y-DNA to do surname research to tie in to the ancient annals and what they say about the evolution of surnames from those ancient genealogies. And we're beginning to see a little bit of that. Certainly the McCarthys have done some great research on tying in their surname to the annals and looking at the different genetic McCarthys to see who are the genuine McCarthys and who are McCarthys who possibly adopted the name rather than being directly in the bloodline. And I think over the course of the next couple of years, we're going to see more and more surnames directly associated with the annals as a result of DNA testing, which will either support or refute the claims that the ancient annals are making. Because we know that some of the ancient annals probably were quite propagandist in nature, and they were politically motivated. Everybody wanted to be related to the O'Brien. Well, now we'll be able to see which O'Briens are genetically related to Brian Boru and which ones are not. So again, a very exciting development to look forward to in the future.
Fantastic. So just a matter of interest, are DNA tests expensive?
Not anymore. When they first came out about 15 years ago, they were very expensive. You're talking like $1,000, that type of thing. And I certainly remember one being advertised for $999. But the prices come right down now. So, for example, if you were to do a Y-DNA test today, that would cost you $149, which is around about €120, something like that. If you were to do a mitochondrial test, the cheapest one you would do would be, I think it's $69, which is about €49, that type of thing. And the autosomal DNA test, the cheapest you can get is $99, which again is about €88. So they've come down considerably. They're certainly at the level now where if someone said to you, what do you want for Christmas? You could say, well, it's funny you should ask. I want my DNA tested. So they have come down a lot, and it's now a lot more affordable than it was previously, yeah.
Very good. So are you speaking anywhere in the near future?
I'll be speaking at the Decent Plan Gathering in Neenah in August, and I'll also be speaking then in Limerick at the genealogy event, which is being organised by Bridget Bray. That's on the 3rd of September. The Gleeson Gathering is on from the 19th to the 24th, and I'll be speaking on the 20th of August in Neenah at the Scouts Hall. And then, of course, in October, we've got our 4th year of DNA lectures at Back to Our Past, and we've got a fantastic lineup of speakers. We've got Professor Dan Bradley talking about recent advances in ancient Irish genealogy, because he's been DNA testing ancient remains from about 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years ago, which is very, very interesting. We're also going to have the people that run the O'Brien Project coming from Australia to talk about the O'Briens, the dynasty, and the type of DNA signatures we're seeing there. I'll be talking about how to identify World War I soldiers who are being dug up on the green fields of France to this day. They find about 30 to 60 people's remains in Flanders every year, and I'll be talking about how we identify them using DNA. And then there'll be a variety of other topics as well, including one on Thomas Kent and how they use DNA to actually identify the remains of Thomas Kent down in Cork, and were able to repatriate him to, I think it was Holy Cross Cemetery. Yeah. So some really, really great, interesting topics, and relevant to the year that's in it as well.
Fantastic. Maurice, that's great. Thanks very much for speaking to us today, and best luck with your work in the future.
Thanks so much, Gunnar. Thanks for having me.
To conclude, all shows are now on podcast, so you can gain access at the Radio Cork Boschkin website, rcb.e. Thanks for listening, and tell your friends and relatives about the Genealogy Radio Show. Keeping you in the loop. See you the same time next week.
Did you ever stop and wonder if you could be related to everyone with your last name?
Just think, if you're a Lincoln, how you'd be congratulated if Honest Abe were someone you could claim.
To clear up any mystery, just check your family history.
Genealogy's the name of the game. Now some ancestors you'll find you want to hide,
but most of them will fill your heart with pride.
Oh, your family tree, your family tree. Check your genealogy, find who was who and how who came to be. On your family, 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 family tree.